Hi, and welcome to this week's Nasty Nelson podcast, brought to you by Pickleball News Asia. This week we're going to review a few stories that caught our eye on Pickleball News Asia. But before we do that, if you like what we do and would like to help us spread the word a little further, please do like the video or subscribe to the channel. It helps a lot, and of course we really do appreciate it. But with that, let's get on to the topics of hand this week. So we were looking through some of the stories that came across the pages of pickleballnewsasia.com, and there were a few that caught my eye that I felt I wanted to speak about in a little bit more detail. For each story, we'll put the link in the description below so you can actually go to the page and see the story in full and read about it for yourself. First one I wanted to look at was Quang Duong. Our headline was Quang Duong encounters a string of heartbreaks in APP Sacramento. So this one was really interesting to me because if you've seen previous podcasts I've done and some of the reporting we've done on PNA, I've always been quite critical of the path that the Quang Duong team, headed by the father, took when they kind of fell into contractual difficulties with PPA, and then he effectively had to part ways with them. I always thought it was a big mistake. I felt it was a big misjudgment on the part of that team, overestimating the power of his position in Asia over and above what PPA would eventually do in Asia. So ultimately, I felt it left him isolated, playing in substandard tournaments. And long term, my fear was it would always make it very difficult for Quang Duong to come back in at the level that he left the PPA. So I'm really pleased that he's back in the US and he's competing in APP. And I hope that it ends up being a path for him back to the PPA. But here's my concern. His string of heartbreaks at APP were not all about bad results. He just had some bad luck with partners having to drop out and things like that. Ultimately, though, he didn't win at the APP Sacramento in any of the events he did. And this comes back to what I said some time ago, which is, if you are not playing at the highest level with the top players, which is what he was doing at the time he broke with the PPA, if you're not doing that week in, week out, then your level will drop. And this is compounded in a couple of ways, because not only will your level actually drop, so your standard will go down. If you play with players that are not at your level or higher, ultimately your standard will drop itself. And it's not just professionals, it can happen even at levels like my own, where if you start playing in games where everyone is beginners and things like that, your level drops. And when you go back to your DUPA rating, you find you're struggling. So this is just amplified at the professional level. At the same time, though, it's not just that his standard will drop. It's also the case that the level of play during the, I don't know what it is now, 18 months or so, that he has not been in the PPA, the level of play of the professionals in the PPA has also really gone up. So it's compounded, because whilst he's been dropping, the standard of play in PPA has gone up. When he left PPA, if he'd immediately gone to APP, he probably would have been the best player there. But now that's debatable. And that's because of the whole circumstance that I've just described. So in terms of can he get back, I think it's going to be very, very difficult. Will he ever get back to the level he was, where he was like top 8 in the world, or in the top 10 in the world in singles? And I think he was approaching that in doubles as well. I think it's going to be difficult. I think it's going to be very difficult for him to bridge that gap, because in any sport, pickleball or any sport at all, once you fall behind, it's very difficult to get back. You can see it time and time again across like boxing, golf, any sport at all. It's not impossible, but it's difficult. The other thing that's really gone now is, because he was the Asia name, and the PPA, I believe, were going to be really pushing him. But because he's also lost that distinction as well now, because there are definitely bigger stars in Asia, Asian stars that live in Asia that have been competing in PPA Asia, and some starting to traverse over to PPA in the US, who, honestly speaking, are probably bigger draws than him now. So I do wish him luck, but it's one of those horrible situations where it's like, I told you so. Not that they're really worried about what I think, but it was a situation where it was, I told you so, in as much as it's just a really bad move, and it's going to be very tough for him to really get back and ever get back to where he was. However, we know he's talented, and I hope that it does eventually work out for him. So that was that story. Next story I wanted to move on to was one that caught my eye, which was about Manny Pacquiao, the boxing great from Philippines, launching a professional pickleball league in the Philippines with a very large prize pool. So again, we'll put the link to this in the description. But it wasn't actually the pickleball league in Philippines that really caught my attention. It was just the fact that Manny Pacquiao himself is getting involved with this, and you'll see from the pictures in the article that he's playing pickleball, and obviously, I don't know to what extent, but he's obviously getting involved and likes the sport. And what that brought my attention to was something that we often speak about in pickleball, which is the crossover sports. And it's interesting because obviously, like in Asia, it's going to be tennis, badminton, ping pong, crossover sports, where if you play those, you can come into pickleball and usually do very well straight away. But it's interesting because there are other crossover sports, and believe it or not, I believe that boxing is one of those crossover sports, which you may think, what's he talking about? There's no ball in boxing, so why would boxing be a crossover sport for pickleball? It reminded me of a tournament I did a couple of years ago in Vietnam. Again, it was an over 50s tournament, and I was playing a Vietnamese guy who also over 50, but his reaction speed at the net was like really, really fast. It was like playing a 19-year-old. He didn't speak English, but eventually I found I was able to communicate with him through someone that could speak Vietnamese and English. And it turns out he was formerly a professional boxer and was still a Vietnamese team boxing coach. And he explained to me that actually his boxing training was all about reaction, hand movement, and being able to have exceptionally fast hands and to be able to react to stimuli, usually your opponent, very fast. So it actually made a lot of sense that his hand speed at the net was so devastatingly fast. So it brought me to this interesting thing again, where unlike almost any other sport, again, racket sport, the crossovers available that really make sense for pickleball are so much more varied, and that's why I think you see people coming from so many sports. In Malaysia, I don't see that many from boxing, to be honest, but I do see people from a lot of footballers. I see a lot of volleyball players as well that come in and actually do pretty well. They take a little bit longer to adjust to some of the nuances of the game than tennis players, but when they get into it, sometimes the skills they bring from those other sports really lend themselves to pickleball well, and they become some of the top players in the region. So, food for thought. I'm interested in your comments, interested to know if there's any other sports that, not obviously, but you feel or you have seen really lend themselves to actually being able to play pickleball well. And if you do, please put them in the comments. It's always good to see what people have to say. And now I'm going to just move on to one more story for this week. And that story is about, headline is, written by our editor, Martin. Pickleball in Japan finds home in hotels, shopping centres as the sport continues to boom. And I find this one interesting because if we take places like Tokyo, Hong Kong, Singapore, they've struggled to have the development of courts and the implementation of courts at the same scale and speed as, for instance, we've seen in Malaysia. Maybe Malaysia is the outlier in terms of how quickly courts have been able to spring up. So we know that there's probably an oversupply of courts in Malaysia right now. But when you look at the cost of land and the cost of rent in particularly those cities, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Singapore, it's actually just cost prohibitive to build pickleball facilities. But what's interesting here is in Japan, they're starting, hotels, as an example, are actually starting to put pickleball courts within their facilities within the hotel. So I think there's a hotel that I actually stayed in when I was in Shinagawa Prince Hotel. So I've stayed at that hotel. What they've done is they've actually converted part of their banqueting area in the hotel into a pickleball court. And I think from an economics point of view, if this kind of thing continues, it could be replicated in some of those other cities like Singapore, which has a lot of mall space, has very big hotels as well. It could be the case that they can slowly catch up with places like Malaysia in terms of actually starting to get pickleball courts built in multiple locations to serve the demand that's definitely there, and do it in a way that is actually a little bit more economic, because building a pickleball facility like the ones we see in Malaysia, where you've got 20 courts across a very wide area, is probably just not ever going to happen en masse in any of those cities. But putting them within these facilities means that they can pop up all over the place and probably be more economic to run and keep the prices down. So it's an interesting story. You can take a look at it, but my hope there is that this actually is something that does pick up, because it would be great to see more pickleball courts like this, particularly in places like Singapore, where they're often still playing in the public courts by the flats and things like that. It would open up facilities and help them develop the game as well. So with that, those are the stories that I wanted to cover this week. I hope they gave you food for thought, were interesting for you. And as I said, if there's anything that you disagree with, agree with, or you want to add to, please do put in the comments, because it's really, really interesting, and we love answering the comments that come. But with that, hope you've enjoyed this week's Nasty Nelson. Don't forget to subscribe or like the video, or both if you like what you saw. But with that, until next week, we will see you soon.